There is a name that has traveled across 900 years, across deserts and oceans, across languages and empires, and it still stops people in their tracks the moment they hear it. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, a man born in a small village near the Caspian Sea, who grew up to become one of the most towering spiritual figures in human history. A man whose students did not just admire him, they were transformed by him. They walked into his gatherings broken, confused, arrogant, lost, addicted to the world, terrified of poverty, obsessed with status, and they walked out different people, not because he gave them money, not because he gave them power, but because he gave them secrets. Secrets about the soul, secrets about God, secrets about themselves that they had never been brave enough to face. Tonight, we are going to sit at that same gathering. We are going to travel back to 11th century Baghdad, to a small corner of a mosque, to a man wrapped in a simple cloak, speaking to thousands of people who had walked for days just to hear him say a single sentence. We are going to uncover 5 secrets, 5 teachings that changed the lives of everyone who heard them. And if you listen closely, if you let these words actually enter your heart instead of just passing through your ears, they might just change your life too. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand the depth of what this man taught without understanding the fire he walked through to learn it himself. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani was born in the year 1077 in a region called Gilan, south of the Caspian Sea, in what is modern-day Iran. His father passed away when he was young, and he was raised primarily by his mother, a woman of deep faith and quiet strength. There is a story told about the day he left home for Baghdad, a story so famous that it has been repeated in gatherings for centuries, and we will return to it in a moment, because it holds within it the very first secret we need to understand. He arrived in Baghdad as an 18-year-old boy with almost nothing, no wealth, no connections, no reputation. Baghdad at that time was the beating heart of the Islamic world, a city of scholars, palaces, markets, and unimaginable diversity. It was overwhelming. It was intimidating. It was the kind of place that swallows young dreamers whole and spits out defeated men who quietly give up and go home. But Abdul Qadir did not go home. He stayed. He studied under some of the greatest scholars of his time. He learned jurisprudence, theology, the science of hadith, the art of rhetoric. But knowledge alone was not what made him who he became. What made him who he became was what happened after the knowledge. What happened in the silence. What happened in the years nobody was watching. For a long stretch of his life, historians tell us he withdrew from the public eye entirely. He spent years, some accounts say around 25 years, wandering the deserts and ruins outside Baghdad, living in extreme poverty, wearing torn clothes, eating whatever he could find, sometimes going days without food. He was not doing this to punish himself. He was doing this because he was undergoing an internal transformation so total, so complete, that when he finally returned to Baghdad and began to teach, people said his words carried a weight they had never felt from any other teacher. He was not repeating information. He was speaking from experience. He had been tested by hunger, tested by loneliness, tested by fear, tested by the ego's endless whispering. And he had come out the other side a man who genuinely feared nothing except the displeasure of his Lord. When he finally began teaching publicly in Baghdad, something remarkable happened. His gatherings grew so large that no building could contain them. People say that at the peak of his teaching, tens of thousands of people would gather in open spaces just to hear him speak. Scholars traveled from other cities, rulers sent representatives, common people walked for weeks. And what they heard was not complicated theological jargon designed to impress. What they heard was raw, direct, piercing truth about the human soul, delivered by a man who had lived every word he spoke. This is the man behind the secrets we are about to explore. Keep him in your mind as we go, because these are not abstract philosophical ideas from a comfortable armchair thinker. These are lessons forged in fire, tested in isolation, and proven true across 9 centuries of human struggle. Let us begin. The first secret Abdul Qadir al-Jilani taught his students was this: real trust in God is not a feeling. It is a decision you make with your actions, especially in the exact moment when trusting feels the most illogical. This brings us back to that famous story of his journey from Gilan to Baghdad, because it is the perfect illustration of this secret in action. When he was preparing to leave his village as a young man, his mother, in an act of extraordinary faith, sewed 40 gold coins into the lining of his coat, a portion of the small inheritance left by his father. Before he departed, she made him promise one thing. She told him, "My son, always speak the truth, no matter what it costs you." He promised her, and he set off with a caravan traveling toward Baghdad. Somewhere along that journey, the caravan was ambushed by a group of bandits. Chaos erupted. Travelers were robbed of their belongings, their money, their valuables. Everyone terrified, everyone pleading, everyone trying to hide what little they had left. In the middle of this chaos, one of the bandits approached the young Abdul Qadir and asked him a simple question. Do you have anything of value? Now think about this moment. Think about the position this young boy was in. He was far from home, surrounded by armed robbers, and he had 40 gold coins sewn into his coat that nobody could see. Every rational instinct, every survival mechanism in a normal human being would scream at him to lie. Just say no. Just say you have nothing. Nobody would know. Nobody would ever find out. It would cost him nothing to lie in that moment, and it might cost him everything to tell the truth. But he remembered his promise to his mother. And so, remarkably, calmly, he told the bandit the truth. He said he had 40 gold coins sewn into his coat. The bandit did not believe him at first. He assumed the boy was either joking or foolish, so he brought him to the leader of the group. The leader asked him the same question, and again Abdul Qadir told the truth. 40 gold coins, sewn into the lining of his coat. When they cut open the coat and found exactly what he had described, the bandit leader was stunned. He asked him why on earth he would reveal something that could so easily have remained hidden, something that would cost him everything he owned. And the young Abdul Qadir gave an answer that is still repeated today, 900 years later, in gatherings across the world. He said that he had promised his mother he would always tell the truth, and he was not willing to break that promise for the sake of gold. This answer did something extraordinary to that bandit leader. It broke something open in him. He reportedly began to weep right there on the road and said something to the effect of, "You have not betrayed your mother's trust for the sake of a few coins, and here I have been betraying my Creator for years for the sake of this same kind of worldly gain." History tells us that this encounter led to the repentance of the entire group of bandits. Men who had built their lives around theft and violence were shaken to their core by the sight of a young boy's unwavering honesty and trust, and they abandoned that life entirely. Now let us slow down and extract the actual secret hidden inside this story, because it is easy to hear it as a nice tale and move on without absorbing what it is truly teaching. The lesson is not simply be honest. The lesson is far deeper than that. The lesson is that trusting God fully means being willing to accept the worst possible immediate outcome in this world for the sake of obeying Him and Him alone. In that moment on the road, telling the truth could have meant losing everything, or worse. Lying could have meant safety, comfort, and the preservation of his wealth. Every worldly calculation pointed towards deception, and yet he chose obedience anyway, because his trust was not in the outcome. His trust was in the one who controls all outcomes. This is what Abdul Qadir al-Jilani spent his entire life teaching his students since. He used to say, in various forms across his recorded teachings, that a servant of God has not truly tasted faith until he stops calculating outcomes based on his own strategies and starts surrendering outcomes entirely to God, while still doing what is right in front of him. This is the essence of the concept known as tawakkul, complete reliance and trust in God. But it is crucial to understand that tawakkul does not mean passivity. It does not mean sitting back and doing nothing. It means doing the right action, the honest action, the difficult action, and then releasing your grip on the results. Think about how differently most of us live. We tell small lies to protect our comfort. We compromise our values to protect our income. We stay silent about injustice to protect our reputation. We chase security through our own scheming rather than through sincerity. Because deep down, we do not actually trust that doing the right thing will lead to a good outcome. We trust our own cleverness more than we trust God's plan. This is exactly the disease Abdul Qadir al-Jilani diagnosed in his students, and exactly what he spent his life trying to cure. He would often remind his students that provision, safety, honor, and outcome all belong to God alone, and that no amount of scheming, lying, or manipulating can bring you a single grain of what has not been written for you, just as no amount of honesty and sincerity can push away a single grain of what has been written for you. If this is true, and he believed it with absolute certainty, then what is the point of compromising your integrity for temporary gain? You are not actually protecting yourself by lying. You are only damaging your own soul while gaining nothing that was not already coming to you regardless. This first secret is a direct challenge to how most people live their entire lives. We build our decisions around fear of loss and hunger for gain, constantly calculating the safest path, the path most likely to protect our interests. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is telling us, through both his words and his own example on that road outside Baghdad, that this entire framework is built on a false foundation. The truly free human being is the one who has stopped calculating and started trusting. The one who does what is right, regardless of what it appears to cost, because he knows, with unshakable certainty, that nothing is truly lost by obeying God, and nothing is truly gained by disobeying Him. Let this sink in for a moment before we move to the second secret, because this first one alone, if actually applied, would transform the way you make decisions for the rest of your life. The second secret Abdul Qadir al-Jilani taught his students concerns the hidden disease that quietly poisons even our best actions. A disease he spoke about more than almost any other topic. This disease is the corruption of sincerity, what is known in the spiritual tradition as showing off, seeking the praise and validation of people, rather than seeking the pleasure of God alone. He used to warn his students again and again that a person can pray, fast, give charity, study knowledge, help others and appear outwardly righteous, while their heart is secretly starving for one thing only, the admiration of other human beings. And he taught that this hidden hunger for praise can quietly destroy the entire spiritual value of an action, even while the action itself looks perfect on the outside. Think about how subtle and dangerous this disease actually is. It does not announce itself. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I am going to be a hypocrite." Instead, it creeps in slowly, disguised as normal human desire. You do something good and a small part of you hopes someone notices. You help someone and a small part of you hopes it gets mentioned to others. You gain some knowledge, and a small part of you enjoys being seen as knowledgeable more than you enjoy the knowledge itself. This is exactly what Abdul Qadir al-Jilani spent years warning his students about, because he understood that this disease is far more dangerous than obvious sin, precisely because it hides inside acts of apparent goodness. He would often tell his students a piercing question to ask themselves. If you knew, with complete certainty, that not a single human being would ever find out about this good deed, would you still do it with the same intensity, the same care, the same excellence? If the answer is no, if your effort quietly decreases the moment you know no one is watching, then he taught that this reveals exactly who or what you were truly serving all along. Were you serving God or were you serving the opinions of people? He described sincerity, what is called ikhlas, as one of the rarest treasures a human being can possess, precisely because it requires such radical honesty with yourself. It requires you to examine your own intentions again and again, catching the ego every time it tries to sneak validation seeking into acts that are supposed to be purely for God. And he taught that this internal battle, the battle to purify intention, is actually a greater struggle than any external hardship a person might face. Fighting your own desire for praise is harder than fighting poverty. It is harder than fighting hunger. It is harder than fighting an external enemy, because the enemy in this case lives inside your own chest, disguised as your own voice. One of the powerful teachings attributed to him involves the idea that a small deed done with complete sincerity is worth infinitely more in the sight of God than a massive deed done partly for the sake of people's approval. This completely inverts how most of us measure our own worth and success. We are conditioned by the world around us to measure value by visibility, by recognition, by how many people know about our achievements. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is telling us that this entire measurement system is an illusion, a trap set by the ego to keep us chasing an audience instead of chasing the truth. He taught his students to actively seek out hidden good deeds, actions no one would ever know about, specifically as training for the soul, as a way of weakening the grip that the desire for praise holds over the heart. Give charity in a way that the recipient never learns who gave it. Help someone in a way that leaves no trace back to you. Worship in the depths of the night when the entire world is asleep and no eye, but God's is watching. He believed that repeated practice in secret goodness slowly rewires a person's deepest motivations until eventually they reach a state where the presence or absence of an audience makes no difference to them whatsoever. This state, this complete indifference to human praise or blame in matters of obedience to God, was considered by him and by the wider spiritual tradition he represents to be one of the highest stations a human soul can reach. Now here is why this secret matters so urgently for us today, perhaps even more than it mattered for his students 9 centuries ago. We live in an age engineered specifically to hijack this exact weakness in the human heart. Every platform, every app, every feed is built around a simple mechanism: visible approval, likes, comments, shares, followers, all of it engineered to feed the exact hunger Abdul Qadir al-Jilani warned his students about. We now perform our kindness, our achievements, our worship, our lifestyles for an audience, often without even realizing we are doing it. Because the entire architecture of modern life has been built to reward visibility over sincerity. If a man living in 11th century Baghdad believed this hidden hunger for praise was one of the most dangerous diseases of the human heart, imagine how much more dangerous it has become in a world engineered around constant public performance. This second secret is not a relic of the past. It is more relevant today than it has ever been in human history. The question he taught his students to ask themselves is a question every single one of us needs to sit with honestly. Would I still do this with the same devotion, the same excellence, the same joy, if no one on earth would ever find out? Let us move now to the third secret, one that emerges directly from the 25 years he spent in isolation, hunger, and hardship before he ever stepped onto a public stage to teach. The third secret Abdul Qadir al-Jilani taught his students is that patience is not passive waiting. It is an active, disciplined, and often silent struggle against despair, and it is the price that must be paid before any real spiritual elevation is granted. Remember what we discussed earlier about the years he spent wandering the deserts and ruins outside Baghdad, living in extreme poverty, sometimes going days without food, cut off from comfort, cut off from status, cut off from recognition. This was not a brief phase. This stretched across decades of his life. Imagine that, decades. Not weeks of struggle followed by relief. Not months of hardship followed by a breakthrough. Decades of a man in the prime of his life choosing to remain hidden, humbled, and hungry. While the rest of the world moved on without him, built careers without him, gained status without him, he taught his students that this kind of extended hardship is not a sign of God's abandonment. It is, in fact, often a sign of the exact opposite. He taught that when God intends to elevate a soul to a position of real spiritual weight, he often first empties that soul of everything it was relying on besides him. Wealth is stripped away so the heart stops trusting in wealth. Status is stripped away so the heart stops trusting in status. Comfort is stripped away so the heart stops trusting in comfort. And in that stripping, in that painful emptying, something is being built that could never have been built any other way. An unshakable reliance on God alone, forged specifically through the fire of having nothing else left to rely on. This is an extremely difficult teaching to actually accept, especially in a modern culture that treats hardship as something to be eliminated as quickly and efficiently as possible. We are constantly told to hack our way out of struggle, to optimize away discomfort, to find the fastest shortcut to relief. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is teaching something almost the complete opposite. He is teaching that some forms of struggle cannot be shortcutted, should not be shortcutted, and that trying to escape them prematurely might actually rob you of the very transformation that struggle was designed to produce inside you. He used a beautiful and often repeated image in his teachings, comparing the human soul to raw metal that must be placed into fire before it can be shaped into something strong and useful. Nobody enjoys the fire. Nobody chooses the fire if given an easy alternative. But without the fire, the metal remains soft, brittle, and useless for any serious purpose. Patience, in his teaching, is the willingness to remain in that fire without breaking, without becoming bitter, without abandoning faith, until the process of shaping is complete. He distinguished between two very different kinds of patience, and this distinction is crucial. There is the patience of simply enduring, gritting your teeth, waiting for pain to pass, while internally seething with resentment and complaint. And then there is a much higher form of patience, one where the heart remains at peace, content, even grateful, in the middle of hardship, because it trusts completely that the hardship itself is being handled by a wise and loving Creator, and that nothing is wasted, nothing is random, nothing is happening without purpose. He taught his students to strive for this second kind of patience, the patience that does not merely survive difficulty, but finds a strange, deep peace within it. He also taught something that is easy to miss if you rush through his teachings, which is that patience is not only required during hardship, it is equally required, perhaps even more dangerously required, during ease and success. He warned his students that many people can endure poverty with dignity but completely lose themselves the moment wealth arrives. Many people can remain humble during obscurity, but become arrogant and cruel the moment fame and recognition arrive. Patience, in his complete teaching, means maintaining steady obedience to God, whether you are being tested by loss or being tested by gain, because both are tests, and both can destroy a person who is not spiritually prepared for them. Think about his own story again through this lens. He spent decades in poverty and obscurity with patience and steadiness, and then, when he finally emerged to teach, he was met with massive fame, enormous crowds, wealth flowing toward him, rulers seeking his counsel. If the years of poverty had not first stripped away his attachment to worldly validation, this sudden explosion of fame could easily have corrupted him, could easily have fed the very disease of showing off that we discussed as the second secret. But because he had already been emptied and refined through decades of patient hardship, the fame that came later did not shake him. He remained the same humble man in front of thousands, as he had been alone in the desert with nothing. This is the real purpose of the patience he taught. It is not simply about surviving hard times until they pass. It is about being so refined by the process of enduring hardship with trust in God that when ease eventually arrives, and it usually does arrive in some form, you are strong enough not to be corrupted by it. The struggle is preparing you not just to survive the difficulty, but to survive the success that may follow it, which for many people turns out to be the far more dangerous test. If you are in a season of your life right now that feels like a desert, a season where nothing seems to be moving, where your effort seems invisible, where you feel forgotten and stuck while others around you seem to be advancing, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani's third secret is speaking directly to you. He is telling you that this season may not be punishment. It may be preparation. It may be the fire that is shaping you into someone strong enough to carry whatever is coming next. The task in front of you is not to escape the fire through impatience and shortcuts, but to remain faithful inside it, trusting the one who lit it. Now let us turn to the fourth secret, one that flows naturally out of everything we have discussed so far. Because true patience and true sincerity almost always produce this next quality as a natural fruit. The fourth secret Abdul Qadir al-Jilani taught his students is the discipline of humility, and specifically, the practice of genuinely valuing and serving others, no matter how far beneath you they may appear on the surface. By the time Abdul Qadir al-Jilani had become one of the most famous spiritual teachers in the entire Islamic world, with tens of thousands gathering to hear him, with scholars and rulers seeking his advice, he could easily have allowed this status to change how he treated ordinary people. This is, unfortunately, the most common pattern we see throughout human history. Power and recognition tend to inflate a person's sense of self-importance, and that inflation tends to leak out into how they treat those who cannot offer them anything in return. But those who studied under him and wrote about him consistently describe the opposite pattern. They describe a man who, despite his towering reputation, remained approachable, gentle, and deeply attentive to the poor, the struggling, and the overlooked members of society. He is remembered for personally caring for the sick, for feeding the hungry with his own hands, for treating servants and the marginalized with the same dignity and warmth he extended to scholars and rulers. This was not an act. This was not a performance calculated to build a certain image, because as we already discussed, he despised the very idea of performing goodness for an audience. This was simply who he had become through decades of internal work. A man whose humility was not a strategy, but a genuine reflection of his understanding of his own smallness before God. He taught his students that true humility does not come from thinking less of your own abilities in a false or exaggerated way. It comes from an accurate and honest recognition of the truth, that every gift you have, your intelligence, your knowledge, your wealth, your health, your reputation, all of it was given to you. None of it was self-generated, and therefore none of it entitles you to look down on anyone else. He taught that the moment a person begins to believe their achievements make them superior to others, they have fallen into one of the most dangerous spiritual traps that exists. A trap that has destroyed the character of countless people throughout history, who rose to positions of knowledge or power, and lost their humanity in the process. One particularly striking teaching attributed to him involves the idea that you should never look at anyone, no matter how sinful or seemingly beneath you they appear, and assume that you are spiritually superior to them. He taught his students that you do not know the secrets of another person's heart. You do not know what private struggles they are fighting. You do not know what quiet repentance they may have made that has been accepted by God, even if their outward behavior still appears imperfect to you. And you certainly do not know what your own final state will be, whether the good you currently possess will remain with you until your last breath, or whether you might yourself fall into some terrible state before you die. Given this uncertainty, he taught, arrogance toward others is not just unkind, it is fundamentally irrational, built on a false sense of certainty about your own permanent superiority that no human being actually possesses. He also connected humility directly back to the earlier secret of sincerity. He taught that a person who is truly focused on pleasing God rather than impressing people naturally loses interest in the entire game of social hierarchy and status comparison. If your goal is validation from other humans, then you are constantly, whether consciously or not, ranking yourself against others, measuring your worth by comparison. But if your entire focus shifts toward pleasing God alone, this comparison game becomes almost irrelevant, because your value is no longer determined by where you stand relative to other people. It is determined by your sincerity and effort in your relationship with your Creator, something no other human being can measure or rank you on. He would often remind his students of a powerful and humbling truth, that many of the people history remembers as truly great in the sight of God were not the wealthy, the powerful, or the famous, but ordinary, humble people whose sincerity and service to others went completely unnoticed by the world around them. He taught his students to actively seek out opportunities to serve people who could offer them absolutely nothing in return, precisely because these acts of service, done purely for the sake of God with no possibility of worldly benefit, are among the purest forms of devotion a human being can offer. There is something profoundly countercultural about this teaching, both in his time and especially in ours. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to build our personal brand, to network strategically, to invest our time and energy primarily in relationships and actions that will benefit our own advancement. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is teaching something almost entirely opposite, that true spiritual greatness is found in serving those who can do absolutely nothing for your advancement, in treating the person who can offer you nothing with the exact same warmth and dignity as the person who could offer you everything. This fourth secret asks a hard question of every single one of us. How do you treat people who cannot benefit you in any way? How do you treat someone with no status, no wealth, no ability to elevate your own position? Your honest answer to that question, more than almost anything else, reveals the true state of your humility. And Abdul Qadir al-Jilani would tell you that this state matters more in the sight of God than any outward achievement you could ever accumulate. Now let us arrive at the fifth and final secret, the one that ties together everything we have discussed, and the one that he considered the very foundation upon which all spiritual progress is actually built. The fifth secret Abdul Qadir al-Jilani taught his students is the absolute necessity of consistent remembrance of God, what is known as dhikr, and the discipline of taming the inner self, the nafs, which he described as the greatest enemy a person will ever face in their entire life. He taught his students that the human heart, left unattended, naturally drifts. It drifts toward distraction, toward forgetfulness, toward the endless pull of worldly desires and concerns. Just as a garden left untended will inevitably become overrun with weeds, a heart that is not actively maintained through consistent remembrance of God will inevitably become overrun with heedlessness, ego, and spiritual disease. He taught that dhikr, the practice of remembering God through certain phrases, through reflection, through maintaining constant awareness of God's presence throughout the ordinary moments of daily life, is not an optional extra for the especially devout. It is the essential maintenance required for every single human heart to remain spiritually alive and healthy. But here is where his teaching goes even deeper. And this is perhaps the most challenging and transformative part of everything he taught. He identified the nafs, the inner self, the ego, as the true battlefield of the spiritual life, more dangerous and more relentless than any external enemy a person could ever face. He famously described the struggle against one's own ego as the greater struggle, greater even than any external battle or hardship, because your ego never sleeps, never tires, never gives up, and is always with you, wherever you go, whatever situation you find yourself in. He taught his students to understand the nafs as something with its own agenda. An agenda are often directly opposed to what is actually good for the soul. The nafs craves comfort, even when discomfort would be spiritually beneficial. The nafs craves praise, even when humility would be spiritually beneficial. The nafs craves revenge, even when forgiveness would be spiritually beneficial. The nafs craves more, even when contentment would be spiritually beneficial. And because the nafs speaks with your own voice, using your own internal monologue, it is remarkably easy to mistake its whispers for your own genuine, rational conclusions, when in reality they are often nothing more than the ego defending its own desires and disguising them as wisdom. He taught that the path to taming this inner enemy requires constant vigilance, a kind of ongoing internal watchfulness, where you learn to catch the nafs in the act, to recognize its voice, to question its motives before blindly obeying its demands. This is precisely why remembrance of God is so essential to this process. Every moment spent in genuine remembrance of God is a moment where the grip of the nafs loosens slightly, where the noise of ego quiets down just enough for the truth to become audible again. Over time, through consistent practice, this remembrance becomes less of an occasional ritual and more of a constant internal state, a quiet awareness of God's presence that accompanies a person through every action of their day, whether they are praying, working, eating, resting, or interacting with others. He taught his students that this constant awareness fundamentally transforms how a person experiences their entire life. Ordinary actions become acts of worship when performed with the awareness that God is present and watching. Difficulties become easier to bear when a person feels the nearness of God rather than facing hardship in isolation. Temptations lose much of their pull when a person is consciously aware that indulging them would mean acting in direct disregard of the very presence they are trying to cultivate throughout their day. This is why he considered dhikr and the taming of the nafs to be the foundation beneath everything else he taught. Without this foundation, sincerity crumbles under pressure, trust in God weakens during hardship, patience runs out too quickly, and humility gives way to pride the moment success arrives. But with this foundation firmly established, all of the other secrets become sustainable, because the heart is being continuously nourished and protected by its connection to God, rather than being left to run on willpower alone, which inevitably runs dry. He gave his students practical guidance for building this discipline, encouraging them to set aside dedicated time, especially in the quiet hours of the night when the world is asleep and distractions are minimal, to sit with God, to reflect, to remember, to examine their own hearts honestly. He taught that these quiet hours of the night hold a unique power for spiritual transformation, precisely because they strip away the noise and performance of daily social life. In the middle of the night, there is no audience to impress, no reputation to maintain, nothing but you and your Creator. He believed that a person's true spiritual state is most honestly revealed in these private hours, and that consistent effort during this time gradually reshapes a person's character in ways that public worship alone cannot achieve. He also warned his students against a common mistake, the assumption that taming the nafs is a battle that is ever fully completed. He taught that this struggle continues throughout a person's entire life, that even the most spiritually advanced individuals must remain vigilant until their very last breath. Because the moment a person assumes they have fully conquered their ego, that very assumption becomes evidence that the ego has, in fact, won a significant victory, disguising its continued presence as spiritual accomplishment. True humility before this struggle means never becoming complacent, never assuming you have arrived, and continuing the work of remembrance and self-examination every single day of your life. We have now traveled through all 5 of these secrets together, and I want you to notice something remarkable about how they connect to one another. Because they were never meant to be understood as 5 separate, disconnected lessons. They form a single, unified path. It begins with trust, the willingness to obey God fully even when obedience appears costly, as we saw in that young boy telling armed bandits the truth about the gold sewn into his coat. This trust naturally requires sincerity. Because if you are truly focused on pleasing God rather than people, then trusting Him fully, even when no one is watching to reward your obedience, becomes possible in a way it never could if you were secretly performing for an audience. This sincerity, in turn, requires patience, because sincerity is rarely rewarded quickly or visibly, and a person must be able to endure long seasons of apparent invisibility and hardship without abandoning their commitment to doing what is right for God's sake alone. This patience produces genuine humility, because a person who has been refined through hardship naturally loses the arrogance that often accompanies unearned or unexamined success, and instead develops a deep appreciation for the struggles of others and a genuine desire to serve them without expecting anything in return. And underneath all of it, holding the entire structure together, is the constant remembrance of God and the ongoing discipline of taming the ego. Because without this foundation, every other virtue eventually erodes under the pressure of a heart that has drifted away from its creator. This is why Abdul Qadir al-Jilani's teachings have survived for 9 centuries, passed down through countless generations, translated into dozens of languages, studied by millions of people across continents and cultures who never met him, never lived in his era, and yet still feel the weight of his words landing directly on their own lives. He was not teaching abstract philosophy disconnected from real human struggle. He was teaching a path that he himself had walked. Through poverty, through isolation, through hunger, through eventual fame and recognition, a path tested and proven across every possible circumstance a human being could face. The question now is not whether these secrets are true. History has already answered that question through the transformed lives of countless students who sat before him and countless more who have studied his teachings in the centuries since. The real question is whether you are willing to actually apply them. It is one thing to nod along, to feel a brief moment of inspiration, and then return immediately to the same patterns of dishonesty, performance, impatience, arrogance, and forgetfulness that defined your life before you heard any of this. It is another thing entirely to let these 5 secrets genuinely reshape how you make decisions, how you treat people who can offer you nothing, how you handle the seasons of your life that feel like a desert, and how you spend the quiet hours when no one else is watching. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani did not become who he became by accident. He became who he became through decades of deliberate, often painful, internal work, refusing shortcuts, refusing to compromise his integrity for comfort or gain, choosing truth over convenience, sincerity over recognition, patience over premature relief, humility over pride, and remembrance over distraction, day after day, year after year, until these choices were no longer choices at all, but had become simply who he was. That transformation is available to every single person listening to these words right now. Not because you need to travel to 11th century Baghdad or spend 25 years alone in the desert, but because these same 5 secrets can be practiced today, in your own life, in your own circumstances, starting with the very next decision you make. The next time honesty feels costly, remember the young boy and the bandits. The next time you catch yourself craving recognition for something good you have done, remember the discipline of hidden goodness. The next time your season of struggle feels endless and pointless, remember the fire that shapes the metal. The next time you are tempted to look down on someone who can offer you nothing, remember the man who fed the poor with his own hands despite his towering fame. And in the quiet hours of your own night, when no one else is watching, remember that this is precisely where the real work of the heart takes place. 900 years have passed since Abdul Qadir al-Jilani first spoke these truths to the students gathered around him in Baghdad. And yet here we are, still listening, still learning, still being confronted by the same timeless questions about honesty, sincerity, patience, humility, and remembrance that every human heart in every generation must eventually answer for itself. The choice of what to do with these 5 secrets now belongs to you.